very natural to read like this, and this little gizmo makes use of that. Pretty cool. It has a very well-designed curve. Look at this. I didn't make this. Somebody sent it to me. It's also exquisitely sanded. I dropped it twice just bringing it over here. The other thing I like about it, even though this is totally peripheral to its purpose, is that it functions as a bookmark. But this is not the subject of the video. That is. One improvement I would like to make before I even mention anything about this is it would be nice to have a hook on the back or something to pick it up with to give it a little bit more mobility. Ever since before I can remember, I've always liked to read when I eat, especially when I eat. There are admittedly worse manifestations of the need to fidget, like you could play with your tablet or your phone while you're eating, which is by far worse, and it's rude. But this is a great way to do it. I went back into working on this recently because I was eating spaghetti and I splashed a little bit on the book, and that's not the first time it had happened. So I went right back to it and fought against the prototype, which still needed some work. Okay, so look, it adjusts this way. And it doesn't go all the way up to 90 degrees. There's really no reason to go all that high, and there's no reason to go all the way down to 0 either. So I, through experimentation, tried a couple different angles and configurations and prototypes before settling on this, which is what I think is reasonable. If you notice, there are 3 slots in it for the acrylic glass. That's so we can use it with a small paperback like this. Or a more medium-sized book, like Brooks's book here. That's in the second slot. And it even works with Bryson's ambitious history of nearly everything. Kind of a beast of a book. A good book, though. It's kind of different from most of Bryson's writing. He's very serious in this one. But also, you know, in a more medium-sized book, as you move through it, it will be thick on one side and thin on the other, which the different plexiglass settings allow you to compensate by adjusting it accordingly. So overall, do I consider this its final form? Pretty much. So let me tell you a little bit about it mechanistically. Hardboard, also called masonite if you want to call it by its brand name. And I used it for the back and for the bottom, and also for this little thing. I cut these little parts to 30 degrees or 60 degrees or 120 degrees. It all depends on what you consider the angle relative to. All it really is equilateral triangle angles. So let's pretend this is your table saw fence. If you put an equilateral triangle against it and then run your stock against it, the cut that you'll get will be this. Back to hardboard, it is cuttable, sandable, and if you want to get it dark like this, oilable. some point you'll thank yourself for making this gizmo. Start with a piece of threaded rod, put a coupler nut on the end, and a jam nut to hold it in place. This nut will stop the bearing. This spacer and this bearing came from inline skates. The washer just keeps that bearing spacer from going the whole way through and interfering on this side. Now we can put a nut to hold it all in place. Finally, this nut holds this in place, and we make it all nice and snug. You can't tell by watching, but it's been a month since the last scene, and I've had it in the shop over this time on this bearing, and I don't think it's such a good idea. Instead of the bearing, there's just felt on the bottom, which works well enough. This is quite a distraction in the shop, plus it gets dusty, so I want to finish filming this and get it back in the house. Another thing you wouldn't be aware of is chronologically this is out of order. I filmed a video about reading, and it was a follow-up to this, but I started to sound pretentious, and I have a dreadful fear of that on video, so I made it unlisted. You'll know where to look if you want to see it. And in it, ironically, I didn't mention David Foster Wallace, probably for fear of sounding pretentious. Great author. Okay, let's get the dimensions out of the way in case you actually want to build this. Around 8.5 by 13, but it's just whatever scrap I had sitting around. It's just a little bit shy of the backer board all the way around. The grooves are located at 1 1/8, 1 9/16, and 2 1/32. The entire thing, well, first of all, this brown part, the part that's visible to you, is based on the golden ratio. So there's a little bit added to that because of this board covering it up. The dimension that you see is about 13 1/4 by 8 1/4. And this board itself is 2 1/4. It's just 3/4 material. And this is redundant, but it's 13 1/4 inches long. The apparatus is the interesting part to me, and I smooth all of the edges, and all of it is curvy to make it organic. Inadvertently, it looks somewhat phallic if you use your imagination. That was not intentional, and so you might want to rethink that, especially if you're presenting it to a mass audience. And so I'll give you all the information that you'll need to reproduce the curves in a moment. But behind this end cap nut, we have a knob, a nut knob that we just made. I just made a prettier replacement for it, and see how it fits in. Excuse me, it's frustrating to film. There's a little ring of plastic here, probably PEX tubing, and that acts as a washer to press on this little spring that presses on a brass washer. And so notice that when it's slightly snug, the spring still keeps a little bit of pressure on it. And the brass washer is a little bit less friction, allows it to slide. When we screw it in and make it tight, the spring closes, gets really tight, and if it bottoms all the way out, then it's just like having a direct bolt on there. works surprisingly well. Please remember to cut me some slack. What you're looking at is a prototype, and I expect you to do it better than I did it. And I also expect you to keep your mouth shut because certain comments will get removed. If you look at these two parts here, they're designed to hug against this rail and keep it from moving laterally so it doesn't swing off like this. Now, because these were an afterthought and I just stuck them on later, I never really got them totally tight. And so the result is that even when it's tight, it still has a little bit of play. So when you're doing this, make these hug really tight. Now, as for the base, the diameter of this is about 9 1/4, which is mostly incidental. It's cut off at around 6 1/2. Now, the radius of this curve is rather specific. I don't know what it is offhand, but I can provide you with a template. This needs to be a certain way, because if you make the radius too large, it will radically change the way this part rotates about. And so there's a lot of trial and error involved in getting something that moves down to a point that's appropriate and up to a point that's appropriate. So I'll trace these parts out and make a template for you and provide you with the appropriate dimensions. If you have any further questions, please don't hesitate to ask. This is a pretty cool device. It's been pretty useful, and the only complaint that I could offer at this point about it would relate to the glare. It would be nice to get one of those expensive pieces of museum glass that has low glare. I'm not used to reading through glare, and that's one thing that I find disagreement with, but it's really not that big of a deal. This is what's left of the first prototype. Originally, the idea was to use 2 trunnions. This part would be stationary on the back here, and there would have been a knob that connected these two together, these parts, these uprights. And as you tightened it, it would squeeze this part. It's hard to explain and quite a head scratcher. Over time, I simplified it and finally ended up going with just 1 trunnion. And the trick to doing that is by making a slot. And the slot is not easy. I actually used a router to make this slot. And what's even worse is that the slot has to be angled at 65 degrees and, well, whatever. I don't remember what the angles are, but it's tricky to make something like this. I would recommend that you make it through a lamination. What I'm suggesting would be that this piece and this piece would be separate pieces, and there would be a spacer in the middle. These 2 inside pieces would have your angles. Hopefully I can provide you with a drawing that will get you through that. If we take it all the way up, stick the angle finder in like so, and next apply the interior part of the angle finder to the protractor. We get about 65 degrees on that angle, and doing the same thing for the lower boundary gives us about 38 degrees. The angle of this bolt relative to the back is 105 degrees, and that matters. Also note, in case I haven't been totally thorough here, that this is the lower stop and this is the upper stop. And the bolt in the back has just a little bit of play from those upper and lower boundaries. And here's the plan. Of course, this will be free. There will be a link in the description. We can go over it briefly. I can't spend too much more time on this project, but I do have a couple revisions that I would like to make just about its design in general while I've been thinking about it so much. I'd mentioned putting a handle here, but with the increased nut knob, it's pretty simple to pick up and move like this, assuming your book isn't too heavy. Another revision I'd like to make is to just add a little bit more material here. I would just like to avoid the possibility of this end part breaking off. Next up, this backer board. No doubt some of you are bothered by these fasteners. This is my solution. I'm bothered by this ugly back end. My suggestion would be to put the smooth part of the hardboard facing to the back, and then the fasteners on the front could be covered by felt. I think felt would be a better surface for books. It has a quieting effect. I just think it would be a nice solution. By the way, not all felt is the same. Try to look for the good wool felt when you do a project like this that you care about. One last thing, and this relates to the width. The piece that I used was 1 inch. I would instead suggest that you leave the slot for the 1/4 bolt will still be the same. Leave it, something like 5/16 wide. But I would suggest that you use 1/2 inch plywood or something similar on each of these parts. Making it wider would make the trunnion a bit more stable. It would give it a little more friction, and it would make it look a little less. And so for the lamination process, this little part and this part here would be made out of something around 5/16 material. And then the entire outline would be cut out of something 1/2 inch, and you'd have to make 2 of those. This side part would be something like 3/4, probably, ideally. Also, the bolt was probably not perfectly to scale, but I used a 3-inch bolt. By the way, the radius for this thing is exactly the same as the base, it turns out. Funny how things turn out. I couldn't remember what it was, and then I remembered that I traced one to make the other. Okay, this is a handy thing. I suggest you make it. It's easy now with the print. It's in the description. And thanks a bunch for sticking with me. I apologize for the lack of concision on this one. But definitely worth making now that the bugs are worked out of this. See you on the next subject.